So our speaker today is going to be Mike Ivey, who is not new to most of us. We've heard several thought-provoking and interesting perspectives. Sometimes don't always leave as uplifted, but very well informed. So I'm looking forward to, especially in this election year, what you have to say. On dissent and resistance.
Yeah, at the board meeting last week, we were going over the survey results, and several people had indicated that they don't find an emotionally uplifting experience here. And Dale said, yeah, they had just heard your last talk. This one is a little more positive. And I know it's only been a month since I spoke previously. I don't plan to do this monthly. I'm just getting this out of the way before garden season starts up. This country was founded on dissent and resistance. Years of protest against the British government and many local attempts at resistance finally led to the Declaration of Independence. Dissent and resistance continued to be important themes throughout our history. Acts of protest, disobedience, and opposition were much more numerous and more significant than history textbooks would have us believe. There have been dozens of protest movements, large and small, that are all worth talking about. I've chosen 3 of them to discuss today. One of the most significant protest movements of the 19th century was the fight against slavery. Even before the Revolution, many people condemned the practice and called for an end to it. At least a few of the men who crafted our Constitution recognized the hypocrisy inherent in preserving slavery while advocating freedom, equality, and natural rights. Nevertheless, slavery was institutionalized in the Constitution for political and economic reasons, and laws were passed to protect it. Opposition to slavery took many forms. One very dramatic form of resistance was armed revolts by the slaves themselves. One took place in Louisiana in 1811, when 500 slaves began attacking the owners of their plantations. They were attacked by the U.S. Army and defeated. In 1822, hundreds of slaves, possibly thousands by some accounts, planned to arm themselves and burn the city of Charleston. But their plan was discovered, and 35 leaders were hanged. Probably the most famous slave revolt occurred in Virginia in 1831. Nat Turner led about 70 slaves from plantation to plantation, killing all the white people they found, a total of 55 men, women, and children. They were finally captured when they ran out of ammunition. 18 leaders were hanged. There were also nonviolent ways in which black people resisted their enslavement. Many slaves performed their work as slowly and reluctantly as they could. Whites often complained about the laziness of slaves, apparently not recognizing it as persistent, stubborn resistance. Of course, the most effective form of resistance was escape, but it was extremely dangerous. The dogs used to hunt escaped slaves were not just for tracking. They were attack dogs that would kill if not pulled off in time. Captured runaways faced severe whippings and sometimes physical mutilation. Yet thousands of slaves did successfully escape. Many were aided by former slaves who had already escaped, or by free blacks or sympathetic whites. In 1793, the new federal government passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which guaranteed the right of slave owners to capture escaped slaves anywhere in the United States, required state and local officials to cooperate with them, and made it illegal to interfere with them. This law was often ignored or openly defied. Several northern states passed laws intended to circumvent or nullify the law's requirements. Some of them essentially said, "This is a federal law, so let the federal government enforce it." This led to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which attempted to correct the weaknesses of the earlier law. It imposed extremely high fines and possible jail sentences on any public official who refused to assist in the return of suspected escaped slaves, or for anyone who helped a slave to escape. In response, Vermont promptly passed a law that required state officials to protect the legal rights of anyone accused of being an escaped slave. In 1855, the Wisconsin Supreme Court declared the fugitive slave law unconstitutional. Many officials in other states simply refused to enforce it. When they were prosecuted under the terms of the law, juries refused to convict them. Some abolitionists publicly defied the law and declared that they would continue to assist escaping slaves at every opportunity. In some communities, captured slaves were freed by large groups of citizens that either overpowered or intimidated the authorities. All of this resistance had an effect. By 1860, only about 330 escaped slaves had been successfully returned to slavery, while several thousand had escaped to Canada. When slavery was finally ended by the Civil War, it wasn't because Lincoln wanted to end slavery or because Congress wanted to. The federal government would have been perfectly happy to allow the southern states to return to the Union with slavery intact. A lot of wealthy families in the Northeast depended on the profits from their textile mills, which required a steady supply of cheap cotton, which was made possible by slavery. Wealthy northern industrialists and wealthy southern planters had a common interest in preserving slavery. It was the persistent agitation by large numbers of abolitionists, both black and white, that finally pressured the government to end slavery. Another major protest movement that began in the 1800s was the labor movement. As early as 1824, workers were protesting unsafe and unhealthy working conditions, long hours, and wages that left them in poverty. Typical complaints from the 1830s include a 13 to 14-hour workday, 6 days a week, being paid in company scrip instead of cash, rules against talking to each other or taking bathroom or water breaks, and being fined for lateness or for breaking any of the rules. Factories were cold and damp in winter and sweltering in summer. They were poorly ventilated and full of smoke from oil lamps. Many of the buildings were unsafe. Sometimes the workers were locked in, with predictable results if a fire broke out. A fairly large number of factory workers were women and children, especially in the textile mills. They were paid even less than the men and subjected to stricter rules. The only bargaining tactic available to workers was the strike, and it was used frequently. Of course, strikers had no legal protection. They could be fired and replaced, and this is what sometimes happened. Often, though, factory owners would simply wait it out, confident that the workers were too poor to survive long without income. But the strike was also a teaching tool. It educated the public about working conditions and it set an example for others to follow. Eventually, strikes expanded from just the workers in one industry in one town to workers in several industries in several towns. They became better organized. Small unions began to affiliate with each other and gain more influence. Arrangements were made with grocers to keep the strikers fed. Gradually, workers won some concessions. First a 12-hour workday, then a 10-hour day. But these were piecemeal victories, limited to certain industries or certain states. Added to the causes for discontent were the economic crises of 1837, 1857, and 1873. These were characterized by high inflation, high unemployment, and low wages. Employers laid off large numbers of workers and reduced the wages of the ones who remained, while the price of food and other necessities sometimes doubled. Workers who were already poor became destitute. This led to mass protests in many cities, some involving more than 20,000 people. There were also a few riots in which people forcibly took what they needed from merchants who refused to sell at prices they could afford. These crises increased workers' awareness of class conflict. They began to see their specific problems in a context of general exploitation. By the early 1840s, before hardly anyone in America had even heard of Karl Marx, workers were talking about the conflict between capital and labor. Working class people began to form their own political parties, beginning with the Equal Rights Party in the 1830s. One of its leaders told a crowd at a rally, "We will try the ballot box first. If that will not effect our righteous purpose, the next and last resort is the cartridge box." The crisis of 1873 was far worse than the previous ones and lasted 7 years. Workers became more desperate and more militant. Strikes were more numerous and much larger. Government at all levels used very aggressive methods to suppress strikes and protests. Police, state militia, National Guard, and even the U.S. Army used violence and sometimes lethal force to protect the interests of the industrialists. In one instance, J.P. Morgan and other bankers loaned money to the federal government to help pay the troops that put down a strike. In another strike against a Rockefeller coal mine, the Rockefellers paid the wages of the National Guard troops that were sent in to break the strike. It was not uncommon for strikers and other protesters to be shot down. But in spite of, or possibly because of, these attempts at suppression, the labor movement continued to grow. By the early 1900s, there was enough solidarity among workers that they could employ a new tactic, the general strike, in which workers of all kinds struck at one time. Usually one union would declare a strike and a dozen or more others would join in support. Sometimes these strikes were called spontaneously by the workers without consulting their union leaders, or even over the leaders' objections. Workers began to join the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which advocated direct action. One of their pamphlets said, "Shall I tell you what direct action means? The worker on the job shall tell the boss when and where he shall work, how long, and for what wages, and under what conditions." In order to achieve this, they said, workers needed only to exercise their power to stop working. As one leader said, "The workers are more powerful with their hands in their pockets than all the property of the capitalists." The government tried for 15 years to break the IWW. Many strikes were met with violence. Strikers, including women, were beaten. Some strikers were shot. Leaders were forbidden to speak in public and were beaten and jailed when they did. Finally, in 1918, the government succeeded in sending 100 of the leaders to prison for speaking out against the war. The IWW declined, but the strikes continued. In 1919, a general strike was called in Seattle. 100,000 workers walked out. The city was effectively shut down, except for essential services that the strikers permitted to operate, such as hospitals and fire departments. The strikers made sure people had food. They established a police force of sorts to keep order, but it was forbidden to use force of any kind. The strike was entirely peaceful. After 5 days, having made their point, the strikers returned to work. After it was over, the mayor of Seattle said this: "The so-called sympathetic Seattle strike was an attempted revolution. That there was no violence does not alter the fact. The intent, openly and covertly announced, was for the overthrow of the industrial system, here first, then everywhere. True, there were no flashing guns, no bombs, no killings. Revolution, I repeat, doesn't need violence. The general strike, as practiced in Seattle, is of itself the weapon of revolution. That is to say, it puts the government out of operation. And that is all there is to revolt, no matter how achieved." Strikes continued throughout the 1920s and into the 30s. In 1934, in the depths of the Depression, there were strikes all across the country involving hundreds of thousands of workers. The next year, Congress passed the Wagner Act, setting up the National Labor Relations Board and guaranteeing workers the right to organize, to negotiate, and to strike. 3 years later, the Fair Labor Standards Act established the 8-hour day, a minimum wage, and overtime, and greatly limited child labor. Workers had finally won some basic legal protections, but it had taken 100 years. Finally, I want to look at the anti-war movement. Every war our government has fought met with some amount of protest and opposition. But I want to focus on two of the most unpopular wars in American history, World War I and Vietnam. The United States entered World War I in 1917, 2.5 years after it started. Our government knew that the American people had no enthusiasm for the war, so it launched an extensive propaganda campaign to stir up some patriotic fervor. In the beginning, this failed miserably. Once war was declared, the government needed to recruit 1 million men for the Army. In a month and a half, 73,000 had volunteered. Congress promptly passed the draft. The draft law did provide for exemptions for various reasons, and large numbers of draftees tried to claim an exemption, sometimes as many as 90%. However, there was no exemption for conscientious objectors. About 65,000 agreed to accept non-combat duties. Many of them were treated very harshly by the officers and other soldiers. For the ones who refused to support the war in any way, it went much worse. Typically, they were inducted without their consent or participation. Then they were court-martialed for desertion or other charges and given long prison sentences. Some were beaten and even tortured while in military custody. Other men chose to completely evade the draft by one means or another. More than 330,000 men were classified as draft evaders by the government. When war was declared, leaders of the IWW and the Socialist Party immediately condemned the decision. And I'll insert a footnote here. You may not know that the United States had a robust, active socialist party for over 30 years. The government was determined to prevent criticism of the war that might undermine its propaganda campaign. 2 months after entering the war, Congress passed the Espionage Act, then passed amendments to strengthen it the next year. This law made it illegal in time of war to criticize the war, the government, or the draft, or to interfere with recruitment or encourage anyone to refuse service in the military. The very fact that Congress saw a need for this law tells you something about the mood of the people. But the government went further. The Department of Justice sponsored the American Protective League, a group of citizens who agreed to report disloyal behavior in their communities. There were 100,000 members in 600 cities and towns, and they reported 3 million cases of disloyalty. Opponents of the war continued to speak out. There were demonstrations against the draft in many parts of the country. There was an anti-war parade in Boston with 8,000 people participating. A march on Washington by draft resistors from all around the country was planned, but 450 organizers were arrested and jailed. Eugene Debs, then 63 years old, was arrested in 1918 for speaking against the war and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Altogether, 2,000 people were prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and 900 went to prison. It's impossible to guess how this contest between dissent and repression would have turned out over time, because the war ended only 19 months after we entered it. Too soon for soldiers to come home and report the realities of war. The press had cooperated with the government propaganda effort, suppressing news of defeats and high casualties. 50,000 American soldiers had died in that 19 months, and many more were maimed and disabled. What we do know is that the protesters and resistors, the people who spoke out and went to prison, the ones who opposed the draft, at least made the government work a lot harder to promote the war. The Vietnam War was very different. For one thing, it lasted more than 10 years. And instead of a propaganda campaign to make it popular, there was an attempt to keep it quiet. Our military involvement in Vietnam began in the 1950s, but at that time, most Americans knew nothing about it. Many hadn't even heard of Vietnam. In the early 60s, there were 16,000 American servicemen in Vietnam, some in combat. President Kennedy downplayed our involvement and spoke of helping South Vietnam defend itself against the communists. This was the beginning of what came to be a massive disinformation campaign in which the government lied about every aspect of the war. When our government launched a full-scale military assault on Vietnam in 1964, the protests began. There had already been a few scattered protests that got little attention, but beginning in 1964 and continuing for 9 years, there were hundreds, then thousands, of protest marches, sit-ins, and other public demonstrations. They were small at first, but soon built momentum as they educated people about the war and inspired them to oppose it. Eventually, some protests drew 100,000 participants. Protesters often faced large numbers of police or National Guard. Sometimes they didn't interfere. Sometimes they attacked with tear gas, clubs, and mace. Thousands of protesters were arrested. 14,000 were arrested at a single gathering in Washington, D.C. In 1970, National Guard troops fired into a group of protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 students and wounding 9. This incident fueled the anger of the protest movement and further increased opposition to the war and to the government. As early as 1964, draft resistors were chanting, "Hell no, we won't go." Thousands of young men refused to register for the draft, or returned or burned their draft cards. Others refused to report for induction. By 1970, the Selective Service System was unable to provide the number of recruits needed by the Army. Student protests caused ROTC programs to be eliminated at over 40 colleges. By 1973, the ROTC was unable to supply its quota of officers. Some of the soldiers returning from the war reported the atrocities that had become commonplace. Many veterans protested against the war. Thousands of soldiers deserted and sought refuge in Canada or Europe. Others refused to fight. In 1968, after the Tet Offensive, General Westmoreland asked for 200,000 additional troops to supplement the 500,000 already in Vietnam. On the advice of Pentagon analysts, Johnson refused to send more troops because doing so would, in the words of the CIA report, risk provoking a domestic crisis of unprecedented proportions. The dissent, disobedience, and resistance at home had actually stopped the advance of the American war machine. The protesters had prevented further escalation of the war. All three of these protest movements, the abolition, labor, and peace movements, were grassroots responses to injustice. They were struggles to take back a little power from the powerful and to force the government to do the right thing. None of these movements depended on strong leaders. On the contrary, they succeeded because thousands of ordinary people were united not by a leader, but by a cause. They saw something that had to be done, so they got together and did it. They honored their consciences instead of the law. They took risks. Some suffered and some died, but the dissent and resistance continued. They had a vision of a better world, and they worked to make it a reality. The successes they achieved can be attributed to one thing: pure, stubborn persistence. I want to end with a quote from the Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Let me give you a word about the philosophy of reforms. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.